Hi, this is Kathy with City Farmhouse Studio. Today I want to talk to you about the Fireside cardigan. Using two different stitch patterns and worsted weight yarn, this cardigan crochets up very quickly for a nice winter or fall cardigan to snuggle up by the fire. The link to the pattern is found in the description below. The yarn that I used is the Lion brand Heartland yarn. It is a 100% acrylic yarn. It is 5 ounce, 142 gram skein, 251 yards, 230 meters. It is a medium size 4 yarn. Besides the yarn, you will need two different crochet hooks. One is a K and one is an L, and that is because for the two different stitch patterns, you will be using a different size to get the gauge. For the body of the sweater, you use the L, the larger one, to get a more open, more drape of a fabric. For the border that includes the puff, you use the K so that those puffs stay nice and tight and don't get too sloppy looking. You will also need a few stitch markers just to help you mark along the way and help things go a little bit easier. So the pattern begins with the back, and the back is made up of the herringbone stitch, which you would also need to do to check your gauge. For your gauge, you could begin with a foundation chain. However, for the garment, I like foundation single crochets because that gets you a nice stretchy edge, and it ensures that that width of your foundation will stay similar to your garment width. So to begin, you start with the slip knot in chain 2, and you go into the first stitch, that first chain you made, and you make one single crochet. So that would be your first foundation single crochet. Go back into the same chain, pull one loop out, so that acts as if you made a second chain. Now you make another single crochet. So pull a loop through the chain, pull a loop through the 2 loops. That is your second single crochet. Go into the chain portion, pull out a chain, make a single crochet. And you continue on in this pattern, adding a chain and making a single crochet into it. And I hold that chain that I've made so that I know which loop I need to work into next. So you make enough of these foundation single crochets as desired for your gauge swatch, or if you're just going on into, you've met gauge and are going into the pattern. All right, so once you have the set number called in the pattern or for your gauge swatch, you're ready to begin row 1. And this starts the pattern repeat for the herringbone stitches. So you begin with the chain 2 and you turn your work, and that chain 2 counts as a double crochet in this first stitch of the previous row from here on out. And then you're going to start in the second stitch. You're going to create a herringbone stitch, and a herringbone stitch is a kind of a combination modified different stitch, but it begins with wrapping your hook just as you would for a double crochet and inserting it into your stitch. Then you're going to wrap over and pull a loop up and go straight through, go through the loop that you had wrapped over your hook. Now you're going to make one chain in that first loop on your hook, and then pull a loop through both loops on your hook. Repeat that. So wrap, insert into the next stitch, pull loop up, and wrap that around the first loop on your hook, chain 1, pull a loop through 2, wrap, that goes through the stitch and that first loop, chain 1, go through 2. And what this does is it kind of connects and pulls the stitches at an angle. So you get a little bit different texture than a double crochet, and the stitches angle just slightly to create a herringbone look. Made with worsted weight, or that category 4, and a large hook. You can see how already we're covering a lot of ground in making this fabric. So you continue repeating this all the way through to the end of the row. So I'm coming to the end of the row, and you can kind of see that crossed over loop. That is that second chain of our foundation. So this stitch right here is my last single crochet, so I have 2 more herringbone stitches to make. Finish the row. And then for the back, it says to repeat row 1 for a total of so many rows. So again, you begin with that chain 2 to act as your first stitch. And then you go back into making those herringbone stitches. Now with these stitches, they do form kind of a patterned row. Every 2 rows you can see a horizontal line where right here. That can help you count by 2s your rows. However, you need to be careful not to count your foundation single crochet as part of your row count. So for the back, you continue on just herringbone stitches all the way through. It is a big square panel, so it's very easy to kind of whip through. The front, however, you will start the same way. They are smaller portions, narrower, and you will work a section of straight rows, and then you'll come to where you need to start decreasing on one edge to create an angled opening for your neck collar. Now, both the right and left ones do have different instructions because of how this has a right side and a wrong side with those rows. You want to be sure they mirror image each other and tie into the back panel correctly. Oh, so here I'm at the last stitch and at the double crochet from the previous row. So you just go into it and make a herringbone. So like I was saying, on the fronts, the back will have a set pattern, and you want to be able to have the right and left where these patterns tie in correctly. So the angles need to be on opposite sides of the pattern. So you need to make 2, but you can't use the same instructions to make both. So for front A, again, the instructions start with your foundation single crochet, and you work up so many rows of straight herringbone stitches, and then you begin the center edge decrease. And all that is your chain 2, so your first stitch, and you're going to herringbone stitch in the second stitch. And you work to the end of the row until you get to the 2 last stitches. All right, so I'm at the end of that row. I have my last herringbone stitch in the chain 2, which acts as the first stitch, and I want to do a herringbone decrease stitch. In a herringbone decrease stitch, you're going to wrap over and you're going to do the front portion, the first portion of that stitch, and stop after that chain and before you yarn through and pull through both loops on your hook. You're going to yarn over, go into the next stitch, get to the chain portion, now pull through both. So it's very similar to as if you would do a double crochet two together, but it is the herringbone stitch before it. So that finishes that first paragraph of the center edge decrease. But then it says to repeat row 1 for 3 times. So again, you're going to chain 2 and turn and work the full row in herringbone stitches as you normally would. Before I get too far, this is where I do like to take a stitch marker and just mark where that decrease row is, and that just helps me kind of count rows along with knowing how many decreases I've already made without having to count each individual stitch. It's not part of the instructions, but I always like to tell you all tips and tricks to just make things easier. All right, so I've finished my 3rd row. So here is my decrease herringbone stitch. And then I have 1, 2, 3 rows. So now I can continue to do my next decrease section. So now after that line item that says repeat row 1 for 3 times, it says to repeat the decrease row in the section of row 1 repeats for a total of so many times until you get so many rows and so many stitches. So again, you begin with your chain 2 and herringbone stitch in that 2nd stitch down to the end of the row to where you can make that herringbone decrease stitch. All right, so I'm down to where 2 are left. And again, you work a herringbone stitch to that last chain. Next stitch, herringbone stitch, last chain. So there's 3 loops, and I'll mark my decrease. And then you work your 3 rows. So you continue on that for however long, and that would create your front panel. Now let's work back. I'm going to go back to here and show you what we do for the decreases on this side of the panel. So I've ripped back to where we were before, where we had our straight rows. In that first row of herringbone stitches where we would make our herringbone decrease on this end. Now we want it over here. So with beginning of the row being a chain stitch, getting this to look correct, I couldn't figure it out. So what you do is you work 1 row entirely of herringbone stitches instead of having that row of decreases with the decrease. And then this is the row that will include the decrease stitch. So now you work to leaving 2 stitches left unworked. All right, so there's our 2 stitches. So create a herringbone decrease stitch. Go ahead and mark it. So that is 2 rows of the decrease section. So now instead of doing 3 straight rows, I will only be doing 2 to repeat, to finish the decrease section. And that will match the 4 rows that we did on the first panel. All right, so there is the 2 rows of straight, my decrease row, and the 1 row of straight before my decrease. So I've done the 4 rows of the pattern. And so then you want to keep repeating that for each decrease that you need to make according to your sides. So you'll go ahead and do one more row, a straight, and then your next row will be to where you decrease at the end of the row. Work 2 more straight rows, and that will be the second set of decreases. And you just continue on. So now let's move on for the sleeve. So for your sleeve, you begin exactly the same with your foundation single crochets. And then you have a certain number of straight rows depending on your size. Now, this will be at the cuff. We'll add on a band of the puff stitches at the bottom once we have finished your sleeve. But now we need to increase up to get the length and the width to be correct for by your shoulder. So as on the front we did decrease stitches, here we want to increase. So again, you just chain 2 and turn on your beginning row. Now instead of moving into the second stitch, so your chain 2 acts as your first stitch, instead of working into that second one, we want to make a herringbone stitch in that first stitch. So that is an increase of 1 stitch on your row. And then you want to work to the end of the row. So I'm at the end of the row and I just have that last stitch, which is the double crochet from the previous row. And I want to work 1 herringbone stitch in it like usual, but I want to do 1 more to add an additional stitch at the end of the row. So each row, an increased row, you're increasing 2 stitches, one at the right side and one at the left side. Now for the smaller sizes, you don't need to increase as much as the length you have. So you're going to work 1 straight row with no additional repeat increases, and then you're going to repeat this increase row. The other sizes, you go ahead and chain 2, turn, make that increase at the beginning of the row. So the same stitch, that last stitch of the previous row now has 2 worked in it, the chain and 1 herringbone. And then you continue to the opposite end. So again, I'm at the chain portion, the last stitch, and you make 2 herringbone stitches in that 1 space. So now you can really start to see the increase on both edges starting to happen. Once you finish all of your repeats needed for the set width, make an additional one for your second sleeve, and you can go ahead and start on the cuff. The sleeve cuffs you need to do before seaming your sleeves into the tube because this pattern is not worked in the round, it is worked flat. You could go ahead and sew your shoulders together and attach the sleeves, but don't seam up the sleeves yet. Now to do the gauge swatch for this banding edge treatment, you want to make sure your hook size is correct so that you get a nice proportionate width to your herringbone stitches. You don't want it flaring out or pulling it all in too tight. So looking at the sleeve pattern is going to be a great beginning point for how many stitches you need to get a decent amount of width and the pattern repeat. So I'm just going to begin with a slip knot on my hook. And on your garments, you know you are going to have to fit more stitches on here than what it was on the herringbone stitches. So what I've did is I always just divided it in half and then put a stitch marker to mark that section. And then especially on the front panels and around the bottom edge, which you do at once everything's sewn together, just keep folding those halves and marking it to where you have smaller chunks. And that way you know I need to fit so many stitches in between the stitch markers and it doesn't get as lopsided with how many stitches are in each area. So then you take your stitch number. So I'm doing the sleeve edge, which is 34 for the smaller sizes, and I would have 4 sections. So 34 divided by 4 is 8.5. So I know that the first section I'll do 8, then 9, then 8, and then 9, and that will get me my 34 stitches. So you just begin by single crocheting along that opposite end of your foundation, single crochet. 3, this is 4, so I want to be sure it's about in half. 5. Once you've done your single crochets around the edges, you're ready to do row 1 of the edging pattern. So you begin with the chain 3 and turn. And again, in the second stitch of the previous row, you just make a double crochet. And then you're going to chain 2 and double crochet in that same spot. And now you're going to begin the repeat pattern of skipping 2 stitches and making a puff. And a puff is yarning over your hook like you would a double crochet, inserting it in, and you pull up a loop just about the same height as your double crochet. You want to do that 4 times, and then you pull a loop through all of those stitches and that beginning loop and single crochet it to close. Now we're going to make this double crochet, chain 2, double crochet motif again. So skip 2 stitches and work a double crochet, chain 2, double crochet. Now back to the puff. So skipping 2 stitches, drop 1, 2, 3. Now I want to be sure I yarn over in addition to drawing up a loop. Draw through all of those, the original loop, and close it shut. Double crochet, chain 2, double crochet. And this is the entirety of the pattern, these double crochet, chain 2, double crochets, and then the puff stitches. It just is a matter of alternating the rows. So the next row will work a puff in the double crochet section and a double crochet on the top of the puff. I did a herringbone stitch on that one. You continue on until you get towards the end of the row. So when you get to the end of the row, you'll end with the double crochet, chain 2, double crochet, and you'll have 2 stitches remaining. And you go into that last stitch and make a double crochet. So for row 2, you're going to begin with chaining 4. And what this counts is that initial double crochet of the chain 3, and then 1 chain to move in 1 space, because our puffs do not take up as much width as this motif. So in the space of the chain 2 in the double crochets is where you make your puff. 2, 3, 4. And then once you finish your puff, you go into that chain space that closed off the puff, and you make a double crochet, chain 2, double crochet, wear to a chain 2 space, make a puff, make the double crochet, chain 2 double crochet in the top of a puff. And you just keep on repeating. So at the end of the row, I've done my puff, I've done the 1 chain to close it all together. Now I want to make that chain to move out side 1, and then make a double crochet in that last edge. Now we're ready to repeat. Now we're ready for row 3, which is chain 2, chain 3 in turn. And now we start with the double crochet chain 2. And you just continue on the pattern. Just remember the extra chain at the end for after the puff for your last double crochet. For your sleeve edges, you will have 4 rows. So I always found it easy to count the puffs. So there you can see these 2 stack over. So 1, 2, 3. You will need 1 more here to complete your edging for your sleeve. Then the instructions, once you've finished your sleeve edging, you will need to seam up everything for your garment. So then your pattern tells you to, if you haven't already, seam up your front panel, here's your neck opening, to your back panel, and you just line up each herringbone stitch and seam 1 to 1. Inside, I've done a slip stitch through both of the top loops. Then you'll want to attach your sleeves, and it tells you to count down so many rows, and that is where you begin your sleeve on the front. You'll count down the same number of rows on the back side, and that's where the other half of your sleeve starts, and you seam those together. And then go ahead and seam all the way up through the bottom and through your sleeves. Once you have everything seamed, you can begin the edging for the bottom of the garment. On the sleeves, we only had 4 rows. For the edgings, you do 6. So you do the bottom of the garment first, and then working around, you do the front banding around the front opening. Weave in your ends, and there you have your Fireside cardigan. I hope you enjoy this sweater and find it so cozy and warm. Please be sure to like and subscribe to never miss out on any other great patterns coming out from City Farmhouse Studio. Also, let us know below in the comments what kind of patterns you like to make. Love to hear from you. Thanks again. Bye.